This lesson is going to focus on the figures that come out of Chapter 1. Figure 1.1 dissects voter turnout in presidential elections by voter age. We see that the smallest percentage of voters are among the youngest voters, and that increases as the age groups become older. So younger voters are far less inclined to vote versus your oldest demographic, which is 65 and older. This has much to do with why both major political parties, Republicans and Democrats, are less inclined to speak about issues that matter to older people and to threaten the incentives that older people may receive through certain types of programs like Social Security or Medicare. This next figure is going to be looking at millennials in particular and their views on the judicial system in the United States. We can see that if we're just looking at millennials and this particular age group, we see a pretty even split, with half of millennials believing that they can trust the judicial system and the other half being distrustful of it. Now, I should clarify here, if we're looking at the blue, we're talking about millennials who have a lot or some confidence. And then if we're looking at that fuchsia color, we're seeing that they do not have much confidence or no confidence. However, when we further break down the demographics among millennials on the basis of race or on the basis of political party, we can see that the numbers become much more distinctive. For example, white millennial voters are more inclined to trust the judicial system, whereas Black and Hispanic voters are less inclined. When we look at political party, Democratic millennials are less trustful or confident in the judicial system than Republican millennials. Talking about demographics can be challenging, mainly because many people would say that it can lead to stereotyping. And although that may be true to some extent, it still serves a great purpose in understanding what politicians are paying attention to, how they are strategizing, who they want to appeal to. And it can also give us some insight into what might be changing politics, especially in the future. At the same time, demographics can help us better understand the different experiences that people go through in this country. And those experiences shape who they are, what they deal with on a day-to-day basis, and the kinds of policies that are directly going to have an impact on them. With that being said, looking at a significant demographic in the United States, we can look at African Americans or Black Americans, and we see that there are concentrations of that demographic in certain parts of the country. So they are heaviest, as you can see in the key here, particularly in the southern region of the United States, or I should say the southeastern region of the United States. If you've been paying attention to the 2020 election, you know that campaigning can be very focused in areas to garner votes of certain demographics. We also know that the African American or Black vote had major impact on the 2020 election, giving that or moving in the favor of Joe Biden. And then we also see it having an impact on the Senate races in Georgia. Composition is also shifting for older people, and we can see that in these population pyramids. Looking at 2000 to 2050, we can see two different things going on. One, older people are now coming into retirement age, or we are going to have more people in retirement age, which we might see as somewhat of a constraint on the economy when we're talking about social security type programs that are, or Medicare programs that are, going to increasingly need to provide funding for these age groups. In addition to that, we also see a change in the electorate. And so we're going to find that younger generations which tend to lean more left, are also going to have an increasing impact in the way that campaigns are going to be carried forth and the way that elections are going to be determined in the future. Looking at figure 1.4 here, we can look at where populations are concentrated in the United States. So we see they're heavily concentrated in the Northeast and heavily concentrated along the southern regions as well as the West Coast, and very sparsely populated in the Midwest. Now, most Americans do live in urbanized areas, and as mentioned before, many younger people especially are moving out of the Midwest. We can see that there also is a leaning. People who live in the most urbanized, diverse areas do happen to lean more left or liberal, and those that are in more rural areas or less diverse tend to be more conservative. Again, when we talk about being more liberal leaning or left leaning, we typically align that with the Democratic Party. When we talk about leaning more right or more conservative, we're talking about folks that are more inclined to identify with the Republican Party. Figure 1.6 will help you see where older Americans are more concentrated. So there actually is a correlation between different types of states and where older people tend to reside. Figure 1.7 will focus on demographics by race. And we can see that the composition is changing in the United States. Take a look at 1980, compare that to 2014. You had 79.6% of the electorate or voters being white or identifying as white. In 2014, 62.2%. This is going to become even smaller in the future. In 2020, fast forward, we see that the white population makes up about 60%. In contrast, we see Hispanic or Latinx and Black or African American, as well as Asian percentages increase, and they've increased even more so leading into 2020. As this composition starts to change even more, it becomes evident that politicians are going to need to switch up their strategies in appealing to the electorate, appealing to voters, and the policies that are going to impact them. Now, I know we already looked at figure 1.8, but just reiterating the change in composition and how the future of politics will need to focus on policies that impact certain demographic groups. We can again look at where the concentration of Black or African American voters may be. And then we can contrast that to the concentration of Hispanic or Latinx voters. So looking at figure 1.9, we see that the concentration happens to be along the southern border as well as more so on the West Coast. Again, much of the reason we look at these demographics is to make sense of why political leaning may be more prevalent in certain parts of the country versus others. And in addition to that, where the future may be headed when it comes to the composition of the country and where those trends start to persist or may start to change. This concludes Chapter 1. Hopefully you have a better understanding of some surface level AP government topics. We'll be going into much more depth with the material in future chapters.